Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're exploring a pretty foundational text in the field of language learning. It's called Principles of Language Learning and Teaching.
Yeah, this is like if you were to take a course in language teaching,
Yeah.
this is probably going to be on the syllabus.
So we're really tapping into some serious expertise with this one.
Yeah.
And I know textbooks, can be a little bit dense,
Right.
but that's what we're here for. We're going to extract the juicy insights and the aha moments that can actually help all of us on our own language learning journeys.
For sure.
So what's something that this book, tackles head on that you think is important?
Well, I think one of the things that it does really well is that it addresses some common misconceptions about language learning.
Okay.
And one of them is like this idea that adults are just worse at learning languages than kids,
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
which I think we've talked about this maybe on a previous episode.
Yeah, it's like we've somehow, passed our expiration date for language learning.
Right, exactly. That's it.
And so the book challenges that idea. And one of the examples that it uses is of this guy named Francois Gran, who was a language teacher more than 100 years ago.
Wow.
And he tried to learn German as an adult,
Okay.
and he had a really hard time.
Interesting.
And then he observed his nephew, who was a kid, like effortlessly picking up language.
Ah.
And this is what inspired him to kind of question some of these assumptions about age and learning.
That's amazing how, just observing somebody else can really spark those light bulb moments.
Right.
So if it's not just about age, what does this book point to as factors that actually make a difference in language learning?
Well, the book highlights a lot of different things like motivation, the social environment you're in, even just like the quality of the language that you're exposed to. It suggests that all of these things play a huge role, regardless of your age.
It's not just about how old you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also this concept that they introduce called multi-competence.
Multi-competence.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that. Yeah. So multi-competence is basically this idea that, like, second language learners, we have a unique advantage. Like, we're not starting from scratch.
Okay.
We bring this whole set of skills and knowledge from our first language, which can actually be a huge asset.
Hmm.
So, like, you already understand the concept of grammar, syntax, things like pragmatics.
From our native language, yeah.
Right, from your native language.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can actually use that to your advantage.
That's such a good point. Instead of thinking about it like we're starting from zero, it's like, no, we're actually building on, an existing foundation.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, so if it's not just about age, then I'm curious what this book says about how our brains actually process language.
So the book delves into a concept called brain lateralization,
Okay.
which is this idea that, different hemispheres of our brain specialize in different functions. And so you've probably heard the saying, left brain equals language.
Right.
That's kind of the oversimplification.
Yeah, is it really that black and white, though? I mean, our brains are pretty complex.
Yeah. And the book acknowledges that while there is some truth to it, it's not the whole story.
Okay.
So there's research that has shown that people who have damage to the left hemisphere of their brain can still retain language abilities.
So there's more going on than just this simple, like, left-right split.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think that's really reassuring.
Yeah, it means we have more potential than we might think.
For sure.
So I'm wondering if it's not just about, which side of our brain we're using, then what else is going on when we're learning a new language?
So the book explores a lot of different learning theories, and it starts off by talking about behaviorism.
Okay.
So like Pavlov's dogs, Skinner's experiments with rewards and punishments.
Right.
But then it kind of moves beyond that to talk about other theories that are a little bit more nuanced.
I was just thinking, with the behaviorism, I always felt like that was a little bit too simplistic when it comes to language.
Right.
Like just repeating drills and stuff.
Exactly.
Doesn't really capture all the richness of communication.
Yeah. And that's kind of what the book argues, that rote memorization,
Right.
like just trying to cram vocabulary lists, isn't very effective in the long run.
I can totally relate to that. Like, trying to memorize verb conjugations without any context,
Right.
it just would not stick.
Right. And so instead of rote learning, the book really emphasizes what's called meaningful learning,
Okay.
which is more about understanding and applying language in context.
Mm-hmm.
And it highlights the work of Ausubel, who differentiated between these two types of learning.
Okay.
So essentially, it's like for language to truly stick, it needs to be connected to real-world experiences.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, what's the point of knowing all these words if you don't know how to use them
Right.
or when to use them?
Exactly.
Like having all these ingredients for a delicious meal, but no recipe to put them together.
I love that analogy.
So we've got age, we've got brain stuff, we've got meaningful learning.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me to think about how much more is involved than just like memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary.
Yeah, sure.
But there's another piece of the puzzle we haven't even touched on yet,
Okay.
which is how our feelings and emotions impact our learning.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, we've all had those days where like our mood just throws everything off.
Totally.
What does this book say about that?
Yeah. So the book refers to this as the affective domain.
Okay.
So basically, all of our feelings and emotions play a huge role in how we learn languages.
So give me some examples of that.
Well, for starters, it looks at self-esteem
Okay.
and the impact that self-esteem has on language learning.
Self-esteem.
And it introduces this idea of like a language ego.
A language ego?
It's almost like we develop a separate sense of self
Oh,
within the language that we're learning.
interesting.
And so if that language ego is really fragile, it can hold us back.
So if I'm constantly like, criticizing myself or
Right.
feeling insecure about my pronunciation, that can actually have a negative impact.
It can.
Yeah.
And they actually cited some studies in the book that have found a correlation between higher self-esteem and better performance on oral language tasks.
Wow. So like positive self-talk,
Yeah,
a belief in ourselves can actually lead to better language skills.
it can.
That's pretty powerful, but I'm guessing it's not just about self-esteem.
It's not just about self-esteem.
There are other emotions that play as well.
Yeah, like willingness to communicate.
Okay.
So like, are you comfortable taking risks and making mistakes?
Putting yourself out there.
Putting yourself out there. Exactly. And interestingly enough, the book even suggests that a little bit of anxiety can actually be helpful.
Wait, anxiety a good thing? How does that work?
Yeah, it's all about finding that sweet spot, right? Between being too relaxed and too stressed.
Okay.
So a little bit of anxiety can keep you on your toes and motivated, but obviously too much can be paralyzing.
So it's about channeling that nervous energy into something productive.
Exactly.
Okay.
Rather than letting it shut you down
And
completely.
That's a good reminder for all of us. But, speaking of motivation, what is it that keeps us going on this language learning journey in the first place? I mean,
Yeah.
some days I'm super pumped to study, and other days it's like pulling teeth.
Right. Well, the book distinguishes between two types of motivation,
Okay.
intrinsic and extrinsic.
Okay.
So intrinsic motivation comes from within. You're doing it for the pure joy of it, the love of the language,
Right.
the desire to connect with another culture.
That's me with Italian. I just love the sound of the language, the food, the culture.
I love that.
It's just fun.
Yeah.
But then there's also extrinsic motivation, right?
Right. And so that's motivation that comes from external factors. So like needing the language for work or for school or for travel.
So if I'm learning Spanish because I need it for my job,
Exactly.
that would be extrinsic.
That's extrinsic motivation.
Okay.
And the book actually goes even deeper, and it introduces these concepts of integrative and instrumental orientations.
Mm.
So an integrative orientation means that you're drawn to the language because you want to connect with the culture and the people.
Okay.
And an instrumental orientation is more about like achieving specific goals, like
Yeah.
getting a job or passing a test.
So it's not just about whether the motivation comes from inside or outside. It's also about like the reasons why you're learning the language in the first place.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And it's often a mix of all these factors. And then the book also touches on this idea of flow theory.
Flow.
This idea that we learn best when we're challenged but not overwhelmed,
Okay.
when we're fully engaged in the process and enjoying the ride.
So it's like finding that sweet spot where you're stretching yourself but not feeling completely lost or frustrated.
Exactly.
Okay, so I feel like we're starting to build a pretty solid foundation here for understanding what goes into successful language learning.
I agree.
We've covered age, we've covered how our brains process language, meaningful learning, now motivation.
Yeah.
But there's still one big piece of the puzzle missing,
Okay.
which is culture. You can't talk about language without talking about culture. They're so intertwined.
They're two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does the book tackle this connection between language and culture?
Well, it starts off with a rather humorous quote from Mark Twain.
Ooh, I love Mark Twain. What did he say?
He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the French always tangle up everything to that degree that when you start into a sentence, you never know whether you are going to come out alive or not.
That's classic Twain.
Yeah.
Always a little bit cheeky, but there's a grain of truth in there.
Right.
I've definitely felt that way, trying to have a conversation sometimes. Like,
Yeah,
I'm getting lost in this maze of words.
for sure.
But I'm guessing the book goes beyond, just poking fun at languages to emphasize the real importance of understanding those cultural nuances.
Yeah, exactly. It introduces the concept of acculturation,
Okay.
which is basically the process of adapting to a new culture.
Right. And that's not always a smooth ride.
It is not always a smooth ride.
It's one thing to learn vocabulary and grammar. It's another thing to navigate all those unspoken rules of a new culture.
Yeah, for sure. And the book talks about how people often go through these stages like excitement and then culture shock
Oh, yeah.
and then gradual recovery
It makes sense.
as they start to make sense of those differences.
So it's not just about learning words. It's really about stepping into a whole new world
Exactly.
of cultural norms,
Right.
communication styles, all of that.
Yeah, and that leads us to this really important concept that I think we'll probably delve into more next time, which is communicative competence.
Okay, communicative competence. I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I'm not always sure what it really means.
Yeah.
Is it just about speaking fluently?
It's actually a lot more than that. It's about being able to use language effectively in real-world situations
Okay.
and taking into account all those cultural nuances and social keys that we've been talking about.
So it's not just about knowing the words, it's about understanding how to use them appropriately in different contexts.
Exactly, like, can you pass the salt? Means something different if you're at a formal dinner
Right.
than if you're just hanging out with your friends,
Right.
even though it's the same words.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And so how do we get better at that?
Well, that's where this idea of discourse analysis comes in,
Discourse analysis.
which is
Okay.
basically about understanding language beyond just individual words and sentences
Okay.
and looking at how we use language to communicate effectively in different social interactions.
So it's like understanding the unwritten rules of conversation,
Yeah.
like how turns are taken, how interruptions are handled,
Right.
how politeness is expressed. And
Right.
all those things can vary wildly from culture to culture.
They can.
Yeah.
And so those really subtle but crucial aspects of communication can make all the difference.
In your ability to really connect with speakers of another language. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here already. Age of the brain, meaningful learning, the effective domain culture, communicative competence. It's amazing to me how all of these pieces fit together.
It is.
And I'm looking forward to delving into even more in our next part.
Me too.
So we'll see you all next time.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating world of language learning.
Yeah.
Last time we left off talking about communicative competence
Yeah.
and the importance of understanding cultural nuances in communication.
Right.
But there's another aspect of language learning that I think often makes people cringe,
Okay.
and that's making mistakes.
Yes, the dreaded errors.
The errors.
But the book actually has a really interesting take on this.
Okay.
It argues that instead of viewing errors as failures,
Okay.
we should see them as valuable learning opportunities.
That's a much more positive spin on it.
Right.
I like that.
It's like a growth mindset approach to language learning.
Okay. I can get behind that because I've definitely had my fair share of embarrassing language blunders.
Oh, I'm sure we all have. But I'm always trying to reframe those as, stepping stones
Yeah.
on the path to fluency.
I think that's the right attitude to have. And remember how we were talking about interlanguage?
Yes.
That unique, evolving language system that each learner develops?
Right.
Well, the errors that we make can provide valuable clues
Okay.
about how our interlanguage is developing.
So it's like they're little windows into our brains,
Exactly.
showing us how we're processing the language and where we might be getting tripped up.
Yeah, and by analyzing our errors,
Mm-hmm.
like figuring out why we're making them,
Okay.
we can actually start to develop strategies to address them more effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm curious, is there a difference between, simply noticing our errors
Right.
and actually using them to improve?
Yeah.
Like, how do we make that leap from oops, I messed up to, aha, now I understand?
That is a great question. And the book talks about the importance of feedback
Okay.
in the learning process. So it explores different types of feedback and how they can impact language acquisition.
So, is it better for a teacher to correct, every single error a student makes?
Right.
Or should they be more selective about, the feedback that they give?
It's definitely a delicate balance. And the book kind of emphasizes that the most effective feedback is timely,
Timely, huh?
specific, and relevant to the learner's current level and goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. If I'm really struggling with verb conjugations,
Right.
it's more helpful to focus on that
Right.
than to try to correct every little grammatical error I make.
Exactly. And it's not just about the teacher providing feedback either. The book also highlights the importance of encouraging learners to self-correct.
Oh, so like giving them the space to kind of identify their own errors
Yeah,
and come up with solutions.
exactly, because those aha moments when you catch yourself making a mistake
Right.
and you figure out how to fix it are incredibly empowering.
Yeah, they build confidence.
They do.
And it makes you feel more like in control of your learning.
Exactly. It fosters a sense of ownership over the learning process.
I totally agree. It's so much more satisfying to, correct yourself
Right.
than to constantly have someone else pointing out your mistakes.
Exactly.
But one thing that's always puzzled me a little bit is this idea of fossilization.
Okay.
Like sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try,
Yeah.
certain errors just keep popping up.
Fossilization is a really fascinating phenomenon.
It is.
And basically, it's when an incorrect language pattern becomes so ingrained
Okay.
that it's really difficult to change.
So it's like you're stuck in a linguistic rut,
You could say that.
even when you consciously know it's wrong.
Right. And there are different theories about why fossilization occurs.
Okay.
So sometimes it might be because the learner receives positive reinforcement
Okay.
early on for using that incorrect form.
Even if it wasn't grammatically perfect.
Exactly. Like maybe they were using the wrong tense,
Right.
but they were still able to communicate their message.
People understood them.
Right. So they just kept using it.
Okay, so it's not always our fault.
It's not always our fault.
It can also be a reflection of like the learning environment or the quality of instruction we're receiving.
That's right. Language learning is this complex interplay of internal and external factors.
Right. And speaking of complex interplay, one of the things that's really stood out to me throughout this whole deep dive is how interconnected all the different aspects of language learning are.
Yeah.
It's not just about grammar and vocabulary.
It's so much more than that.
It's about our brains, our emotions, our motivations, our cultural awareness, even our personalities. It's
Yeah.
all tied together.
Yeah. And I think this book does a really brilliant job of highlighting that interconnectedness.
Okay.
It's not about isolating one factor
Right.
or focusing on one magic learning strategy.
Yeah.
It's really about understanding how they all work together to create this holistic learning experience.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of pointless for me to beat myself up
Right.
for not being a morning person
Exactly.
and trying to force myself to study before work when my brain is still half asleep.
It's about understanding your own learning style and preferences
Right.
and figuring out what works best for you.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning,
Definitely not.
which I think is reassuring.
Yeah.
Because it means we can all find our own path.
Exactly. And the book actually suggests that learners can even benefit from developing like a wider range of learning strategies.
Oh, okay.
It's like having a toolkit with different tools for different tasks.
I love that analogy.
So if one tool isn't working, you can try a different one.
Right. Okay. So it's about being, proactive
Yeah.
and taking responsibility for your own learning, not just kind of passively waiting
Right.
for someone to spoon feed you the information.
Exactly. And I think part of that is being willing to step outside the traditional classroom setting
Okay.
and seek out opportunities to use the language
Yeah.
in real-world situations.
So like talking to native speakers,
Yes.
watching movies, reading books,
Yeah.
immersing yourself in the culture.
Absolutely.
Okay. So
But even with a learner-centered approach, there's still a place for more focused instruction, I think.
right.
We were talking about the limitations of behaviorism earlier.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should completely dismiss the importance of like learning grammar rules
Yeah.
or practicing specific language structures.
So how do we find that balance
Yeah.
between, a more communicative approach
Right.
and like really focused instruction on specific language forms?
Well, the book talks about something called form-focused instruction,
Okay.
which is basically about finding ways to draw learners' attention to those specific language forms
Okay.
and help them understand how they work.
Within a communicative context.
Exactly. So it's not just about rote memorization. It's about understanding like the why behind the grammar rules,
Right.
how they're actually used in real communication.
So like how does this verb tense work?
Yeah,
Why do we use this preposition in this situation?
exactly. And the book explores all these different techniques for form-focused instruction,
Okay.
from activities that raise awareness of certain language patterns to more explicit explanations and practice exercises.
So it's like a whole spectrum of approaches from
Right.
implicit to explicit.
Exactly.
And the best method kind of depends on the learner, the context, and the specific language feature that you're targeting.
Exactly. And I think the key is to make sure that form-focused instruction is always integrated
Right.
with meaningful communication.
So it's not treated as a separate, isolated activity.
Exactly. It needs to be woven into
Hey.
the the fabric of real language use.
So finding ways to like weave in focused grammar practice within activities that are engaging and interactive
Exactly.
and relevant to the learner's interests.
Absolutely.
That's what makes language teaching an art, I think.
It is an art.
It's about finding that sweet spot between providing clear guidance and fostering learner autonomy, between focusing on accuracy and fluency, between respecting individual learning styles and encouraging learners to kind of expand their repertoire of strategies.
There's a lot to juggle.
There is.
But that's also, I think, what makes it such a rewarding and intellectually stimulating profession.
Right.
You're constantly learning and growing along with your students.
It's fascinating to see how all these pieces fit together.
It is.
And speaking of how all these pieces fit together, I want to bring up one more key concept that the book really emphasizes,
Okay.
which is the importance of context.
Context, you mean like the situation, the people involved, the cultural background, all of that?
Exactly, all of that stuff.
Okay.
So the book argues that language learning can't be separated from the context in which it occurs. You know, it's not just about learning words and grammar in isolation.
Right.
It's about understanding how they function in real-world situations.
Okay.
In specific social interactions within a particular cultural framework.
That makes sense. I mean, I might know the word for apple in Spanish,
Right.
but that doesn't mean I automatically know how to order an apple pie in a bakery in Madrid.
Exactly right. There's so many layers of context that can influence how we use and understand language.
So the book talks about the linguistic context,
Okay.
which refers to the words and sentences that surround a particular word or phrase.
So like understanding the meaning of a word based on the other words that are around it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the situational context,
Okay.
which is like the physical and social setting in which communication takes place.
So the difference between ordering a coffee at a busy cafe
Right.
versus, you know, having a deep conversation with a friend at a park.
Exactly. The language you use would be very different in those two situations,
Even if we're talking about the same topic.
even if you're talking about the same topic.
Okay.
And of course, there's that broader cultural context,
Right.
which encompasses all those unspoken rules and norms that govern communication
Within a particular culture.
within a particular culture.
This is making me realize how challenging it can be for language learners
It is.
to navigate all those different layers of context, especially when they're still grappling with, you know, just the basics of the language. It's like trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces.
It can be overwhelming, for sure. And that's why it's so important to create learning environments that are really rich in context,
Okay.
that provide opportunities for learners to experience the language in authentic and meaningful ways.
So moving beyond textbooks and worksheets
Yes.
and creating those opportunities for real-world interaction,
Exactly.
even within the classroom setting.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that context isn't just something external to the learner.
Okay.
It's also shaped by their own internal factors.
Okay.
So their prior knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
experiences, beliefs, motivations.
So my understanding of a particular text or a conversation will be influenced by like my own cultural background,
Yeah.
my personal experiences, even my current mood.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected,
Right.
which is what makes language learning such a fascinating
Yeah.
and endlessly complex process.
Right. I'm starting to see that, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The value of errors, the importance of feedback, the challenges of fossilization, the interconnectedness of all these different factors, the role of learner autonomy, the art of form-focused instruction, and now this crucial influence of context.
It's been quite a journey.
It has been.
And in our final part, we're going to kind of pull all of these threads together and really delve into what I think this book ultimately offers, which is a framework for understanding this really intricate process of second language acquisition.
Okay, I'm really excited to see how it all comes together. So until next time. All right, so we are back for the final part of our deep dive into this fascinating world of language learning.
Yeah, it's really amazing how many different things come into play
Uh,
when we're trying to learn a new language, isn't it?
It really is. You know, over these past couple parts, we've been talking about, you know, how our brains process language, the role of motivation, even the importance of understanding cultural nuances.
Right.
And I'm hoping this book doesn't just leave us with a bunch of like disconnected ideas, you know?
Right.
Does it offer like a framework for how all these pieces fit together?
Yeah, well, I think you're in luck because that's exactly what these final chapters try to do.
Okay.
They really attempt to synthesize all these insights into like a cohesive understanding of second language acquisition.
Okay.
Now, it acknowledges that there's no single grand theory that explains everything.
Right.
But it does offer, I think, a really valuable map for navigating this complex terrain.
I'm ready for this map. So where does it lead us?
Okay.
What are the key landmarks?
All right, so one of the first things the book does is lay out a framework for categorizing all the different variables involved in language acquisition.
Okay.
So it groups them into these broad categories like learner characteristics, linguistic factors, learning processes, the influence of age, instructional approaches, and of course context, which we talked about last time.
So it's like a multidimensional puzzle with each category representing like a different layer of complexity.
Yeah, exactly. And the book stresses that these categories are constantly interacting and influencing each other. So it's not like a static model. It's more like a dynamic web of relationships.
So for example, like my motivation to learn Spanish could be affected by my age. You know, my previous learning experiences, the teaching methods that are used, even the social and cultural environment where I'm learning.
Right. You got it.
Wow. It really is a lot more complicated than you might think at first glance.
It is a fascinating interplay of internal and external factors,
Yeah.
and it makes studying language acquisition a pretty challenging endeavor.
It does sound challenging. So how do researchers even begin to untangle all these threads and make sense of it all?
Well, they use a variety of research methods,
Okay.
and the book delves into those as well.
Okay.
Everything from controlled experiments in labs to observing language learners in natural settings to in-depth case studies that focus on individual learners.
So it's like scientists are using all these different lenses to examine this complex phenomenon, and
Yeah.
each one's providing a unique perspective.
Precisely. And the book highlights that there's no one right way to study language acquisition. Each method has its strengths and limitations.
That makes sense. You know, if you only use one type of telescope to observe the stars, you'd be missing out on a whole universe of information.
Exactly.
And even with all this research, you know, as much as we've learned about second language acquisition, it's important to remember that it's still a relatively young field of study.
Right.
There's still a lot we don't know,
There is.
which I find kind of exciting.
Me too.
You know, it means there's so much more to explore and discover. So what are some of the big unanswered questions that researchers are grappling with right now?
Well, I think one of the biggest debates revolves around this idea of nature versus nurture in language learning.
Oh, the classic debate.
Right. So do we come pre-wired with a language acquisition device, as Noam Chomsky famously proposed, or is language acquisition primarily a result of our environment and experiences?
Are we born with this like predisposition for language, or is it all about exposure and learning?
Exactly. And there's actually evidence to support both sides of the argument.
Okay.
And so the book presents a really balanced view. You know, it explores everything from strong nativist theories to more interactionist approaches that emphasize the interplay between our innate abilities and our environment.
So it's probably not an either-or situation. It's more likely a combination of both.
I think so, too.
You know, maybe we're born with a certain capacity for language, but how that capacity actually develops depends on, you know, the quality and quantity of the language input we receive, the social interactions we have, the learning opportunities we're exposed to.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, and it makes me think about all the incredible advancements in neuroscience that we've seen in recent years.
Right.
Are those shedding any light on the language learning process?
Absolutely. Brain imaging techniques like fMRI are allowing researchers to actually observe brain activity
Wow.
in real time as people are performing language tasks.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So we can actually see the learning happening in the brain.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And this kind of research is really helping to bridge the gap between cognitive theories of language acquisition
Right?
and the underlying biological mechanisms. So it's
Yeah.
like we're finally starting to understand the hardware and software that make language learning possible.
So fascinating. You know, another question I've always wondered about is the role of consciousness in language learning.
Okay.
Can we learn a language implicitly without, you know, conscious effort? Or is it essential to have explicit knowledge of grammar rules?
That's another key area of research in second language acquisition.
Okay.
And the book explores different models that address this very question.
Okay.
So some models, like those that emphasize implicit learning,
Okay.
they argue that we acquire language primarily through subconscious processes,
Okay.
similar to how children learn their first language.
So just by being surrounded by the language,
Right.
hearing it, reading it, interacting with native speakers,
Exactly.
our brains kind of start to pick up on the patterns and internalize the rules without us even really realizing it.
Without even realizing it. But then other models really emphasize the importance of explicit knowledge.
Okay.
So they argue that understanding grammar rules And consciously focusing on language forms is essential
Okay.
for achieving a high level of accuracy and fluency.
So maybe we can acquire some basic fluency through implicit learning, but to truly master the language,
Right.
we need to engage in more deliberate study and practice.
That's one way to reconcile those different perspectives.
Right, and I'm guessing the book suggests it's probably a combination of both.
It probably is a combination of both.
Right, finding that sweet spot again.
Exactly.
You know, it seems like balance is kind of a key theme running throughout this whole book.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's about finding the right balance between intuition and analysis, between immersion and focused study, between learner autonomy and effective instruction.
It sounds like there's a lot to juggle.
There is,
Yeah.
but it's also, I think, what makes language learning so rewarding
Eerie.
and intellectually stimulating.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been so fascinating to explore all these different facets of language acquisition.
I agree.
But I keep coming back to this question of how do we take all this theoretical knowledge and actually apply it to real-world learning and teaching?
I'm glad you asked that because the book doesn't just leave us hanging with a bunch of abstract theories.
Okay.
In the final chapters, it really dives into the pedagogical implications
Okay.
of all this research.
Okay, good.
So it looks at how these insights can actually inform more effective teaching practices.
So what are some of the key takeaways for language teachers? Like, what should they be doing differently in their classrooms?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is this idea of advocating for a more learner-centered approach,
Okay.
where teachers act more as facilitators and guides, creating learning environments that are stimulating and supportive,
Okay.
and really responsive to students' individual needs and learning styles.
And that kind of goes back to everything we've been talking about, right? The importance of learner autonomy, recognizing different learning styles, finding the right balance between implicit and explicit learning.
Exactly. And the book actually goes beyond just advocating for this approach. It gives specific examples of how to actually implement it.
Okay.
Everything from designing communicative activities that really engage learners to providing effective feedback that helps them grow to incorporating cultural awareness into the curriculum.
So it's really about moving beyond that traditional model of like rote memorization and grammar drills and creating opportunities for students to actually use the language in meaningful ways,
Exactly.
to connect with the culture, to become more self-aware learners.
You said it perfectly.
Well, this has been such an incredible journey.
Yes.
This deep dive has really been a revelation for me. It's made me realize that there's so much more to language learning than I ever imagined.
I agree.
It's complex, it's challenging, it's constantly evolving, but it's also incredibly rewarding and intellectually stimulating.
Couldn't agree more.
And I hope this has sparked your own curiosity about language and learning, whether you're a seasoned polyglot or just beginning your language journey.
Absolutely.
Well, until next time, happy language learning, everybody.